Hello and welcome to Downtime Activities. My name is Matthew and this is the Help Action, our video series where we break down 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons concepts, rules, things along those lines, try and do kind of a deep dive into them and get into the nitty-gritty of how the rules work, how they probably should work, kind of rules as written versus rules as intended, and how you should go about changing them potentially to make them work the best in your games. Today specifically, we're going to be going over something that a lot of the players in my group hold near and dear to their hearts, and that is the sneak attack from the rogue. A big damaging effect that I think gets messed up pretty often. So let's dive into the rules and see how it really works. Alright, let's discuss sneak attack in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. To begin with, I'm just going to read through the rule as it's written, and then go into detail, kind of picking out the little pieces that bring up the most questions, clarifying a lot of misconceptions, and giving the real nitty-gritty on how things actually work. I'll then kind of wrap up with a couple little pieces of advice, though not very much overall, because sneak attack is a pretty good rule that works pretty well so long as you know how to use it. Sneak attack, beginning at 1st level, you know how to strike subtly and exploit a foe's distraction. Once per turn, you can deal an extra 1d6 damage to one creature you hit with an attack if you have advantage on the attack. The attack must use a finesse or a ranged weapon. You don't need advantage on the attack roll if another enemy of the target is within 5 feet of it. That enemy is incapacitated, and you don't have disadvantage on the attack roll. The amount of the extra damage increases as you gain levels in this class, as shown in the sneak attack column of the rogue table. Simple, right? Well, yes, but also there's a bit more to it. Let's break it down kind of piece by piece and go into the real nitty-gritty dirt of how this works here. First of all, let's talk about the weapon you can or must wield in order to trigger sneak attack. First, you have to be wielding a weapon that is either ranged or has the finesse property. I purposely put some emphasis on some words there. To begin with, weapon. Weapon means that it has to be a weapon. It has to be a weapon attack that you are doing. So unarmed attacks, even if they use dexterity, like the monk's unarmed strikes, cannot apply sneak attack if you have a build where you've kind of combined those classes. Rules as written, it has to be a weapon. Next word of kind of emphasis here, ranged. Ranged does not mean all attacks that are made from range, but ranged weapons specifically. This means that thrown weapons are still technically melee weapons, not ranged weapons. So all attacks at a range that use a weapon are not ranged attacks. Even though they are, this rule, they are a ranged attack, it is not a ranged weapon that you are using. So, for instance, things like hand axes will not get to apply sneak attack because they are not a ranged weapon and they lack the finesse quality. However, something like a dagger being thrown does have the finesse quality, so you will be able to apply sneak attack to it when throwing it at a range. And the last one here is the finesse property, which means that attacks can use dexterity instead of strength when using a finesse weapon. I've seen this get mixed up with light weapons pretty often. Finesse and light are totally different words. They are totally different weapon types, and not all light weapons are finesse weapons and vice versa. Finesse specifically means dexterity can be used when making the attack rolls, and light it just allows you to dual wield that weapon. It is light enough you could have one in either hand, and then the dual wielding rules could be used at that point. So make sure you double check, because some weapons that seem like they'd have one don't, and vice versa. A last little clarification here, the weapon needs to have the finesse property in order to be able to use for sneak attack. However, you don't have to be taking advantage of that finesse property in order to use it with a rogue and make a sneak attack with it. What I mean by this is you can totally play a strength-based rogue. This may not be exactly statistically optimal, but you can take a finesse weapon, for instance a short sword, and still attack with strength and have a high strength rogue character who uses those smaller, more agile weapons but blunt force trauma with them just in a more accurate and precise way to get that sneak attack damage. Next, let's break down how you actually get sneak attack damage once you've met those other requirements, whether it's a finesse weapon, a ranged weapon, etc. In order to apply that sneak attack damage, you must either have advantage on the attack roll, or be attacking an enemy that has a hostile creature within 5 feet of it. This will usually be one of your allies, but not always. The creature that is threatening them nearby, or creatures, don't have to be allies, they just have to be hostile to the creature you're targeting. So if you're in some sort of weird mishmash fight where there's multiple different kind of factions all warring together at once, you could apply sneak attack even if you don't have an ally nearby, so long as you have an enemy that is also an enemy of that other creature and hostile to them, threatening them within that same range. The enemy of my enemy can in fact be my friend when it's giving me sneak attack. The creature or creatures must also not be incapacitated. They have to actually be able to be threatening. If they're lying on the ground next to them, that's not going to give you sneak attack. A last little clarifying thing that I think gets overlooked a lot is that you cannot have disadvantage on the attack. Clearly, if you have advantage on the attack and that's giving you your sneak attack, then you don't have disadvantage because you have advantage and they would cancel each other out otherwise. However, sometimes it'll get missed or mixed up when you have that ally within 5 feet and you attack with your finesse weapon, but had disadvantage for some spell effect or something else that's affecting your character, and you would not get to apply sneak attack. Even though you met that other requirement, if you have disadvantage on the attack, you do not get to apply sneak attack. As I was mentioning before, if you have disadvantage from one source and advantage from another, these cancel each other out, and this canceling out also cancels out in terms of how you would apply that to sneak attack rules. So, if you had advantage from one source and disadvantage from another, canceling each other out, you would therefore be able to apply sneak attack damage so long as you meet the other requirement, being a hostile creature within 5 feet of your target. You would have to have that hostile creature within 5 feet in order to get that sneak attack, because you do not have advantage on the attack. You may have had an effect giving you advantage, but the disadvantage cancels it out. So the advantage acts like it wasn't even there, meaning it doesn't give you that I had advantage, even though it got canceled out, so I get to apply sneak attack. On the other end of this though, the cancel disadvantage will not prevent you from being able to trigger that. You technically did not have disadvantage on that attack, because when you rolled that die, there was just one of them. So these cancel each other out, and you apply that logically to sneak attack. Another really big misconception, and one that I've made for a long time playing this game, is that rogues can add their sneak attack damage once per turn. And once per turn is not the same as once per round. Let me clarify. Once per turn means that on your turn, you can make an attack, hit, meet those requirements, and apply sneak attack. However, if on a different turn, not your own, later on in that same initiative round, you were able to make an attack and hit and still met those requirements, sneak attack could trigger again, because this is a new turn. Not a new round, but a new turn. The biggest thing this is applied to is opportunity attacks. The reaction when the enemy moves away from you, that's them moving away on their turn, typically, and this means it is on their turn when that attack is made. So, the short and sweet of it is, yes, sneak attack can work with opportunity attacks, even if you've already used it earlier on your turn in that same initiative round. This is a very potent thing to remember, and something that can be weaponized really well with combinations of different feats and stuff. I won't go into detail here, but rogues making opportunity attacks can be very, very potent. Another really fun and potent way to employ this as a DM is with villainous NPCs. Huge disclaimer here, this is potentially very deadly, so balance appropriately, and this should probably be kind of more reserved for higher level stuff. But if you want to have a super dangerous rogue-like enemy that is kind of a big bad of a campaign, if you give them legendary actions that allow them to make attacks, spending some of those legendary actions, this will allow them to use sneak attack outside of their turn, if you also give them sneak attack or an ability, kind of a villainous NPC equivalent of sneak attack. So the basic gist of how this would work is you would have your villainous NPC make their attack on their turn, potentially triggering their sneak attack or villainous NPC version of sneak attack, and then later on allow them to have a legendary action that they could spend those legendary actions on and make another attack, and that would be outside of their turn, thus allowing them to sneak attack again. This can be a really potent way to make a villain assassin style character deal out a lot of damage and kind of balance up that action economy, but also could potentially be very dangerous and very deadly. So just be thoughtful if you're trying to apply this in your game, that you're not making this kind of death machine enemy rogue that's like getting 4 different sneak attack attacks every round and just absolutely obliterates your party. A last bit of rule to break down here is the type of damage that is dealt with sneak attack damage. There's a lot of confusion on this, but it's actually a little more simple than you might think. Sneak attack damage is extra damage added on to the attack. And this means that the damage type is the same type as the attack was without the sneak attack damage. This means that the weapon's damage type is the sneak attack's damage type. So more often than not, it is going to be slashing, piercing, very rarely bludgeoning. Most bludgeoning implements are not finesse implements, but I'm sure there's some weird way you could figure out how to do that. That being said, this isn't always the case, and even in the case, it's important to kind of clarify the specifics here. For instance, a magical dagger will have magical sneak attack damage, but a regular dagger will have non-magical. So if there's creatures with certain resistances, this applies. If you are making a sneak attack against a creature that resists non-magical piercing damage, and you deal it with a mundane dagger, it's going to resist the total damage, including your additional sneak attack damage. This is also very important to note when playing certain types of rogues or having certain spellcasting abilities that allow you to create weapons that are not the traditional metal weapons. For instance, the psychic blades from Soul Knife or spells like Shadow Blade allow you to make these finesse weapons that can functionally work with sneak attack that deal psychic damage. This means that all of your sneak attack die are also psychic damage, and this is one of the least resisted damage types in the game, so this can be super potent and make it so that your extra damage you're dealing is not getting resisted, even by most of the bigger, scarier bads of the monster manuals out there. This can also apply with certain magic weapons. There's not a ton that are magical weapons that they differ their base damage type from a bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing, but especially homebrew stuff, kind of daggers of light or fire that aren't normally having blades that you've come up with, that you've decided they just deal a different type of damage by default. This would also apply to the sneak attack damage. So that's something to keep in mind when making those kinds of magic items in your game. That's the basic gist of sneak attack, how it works, some of the misconceptions, and how the rules really apply and work. And I typically, in this video series, go over some in-depth kind of advice, my opinions on how best to use stuff. I've got a couple things to say here, just some little kind of nitpicky stuff to help make it run a little better in your game. However, I feel sneak attack is actually a pretty well-designed and thought-out ability that, if you know the intricates of, can typically just be run rules as written. So there's not a whole lot to discuss here as far as advice. One thing to consider is I would certainly allow some things that normally wouldn't be allowed to apply sneak attack damage to apply it. Most importantly, and namely the monk unarmed strikes, it makes for a really fun multi-class character to kind of combine a monk and a rogue and have these kind of agile, precise, unarmed strikes that are dealing extra damage. And it's really not overpowered or game-breaking in any real sense. There's not really a way it can be taken advantage of, especially because you can use all of the monk's special kind of key-fueled abilities on most of their non-unarmed strikes, just using their monk weapons, and a lot of those monk weapons are weapons that would normally be able to apply sneak attack damage anyways. So it's kind of just more of a flavorful thing, and it doesn't really hurt your game to allow somebody to make that style of character. One other last little piece of advice I would give is just to be really mindful about allowing a creature to be considered hostile and triggering that sneak attack if they're not really actually threatening the target. This doesn't have to be them like actively on their turn attacking that same target every single turn, but they should at least be kind of an armed and engaged in combat creature. If they're not really actively a part of the combat in any real sense,
I would be kind of hesitant to say that that is a hostile creature that can trigger that sneak attack. You don't need to be nitpicky here, and you don't need to be looking for ways to take this ability away from your players. Just be realistic and thoughtful about what a hostile creature truly is, and whether or not a creature is that and can give that sneak attack bonus.
And that has been our help action on Sneak Attack. Hope you found that useful. If you did, please check out the rest of our content. We've got a ton of these help action videos going over kind of deep dives on rules. We've got our bonus action series, which is more of a long-winded podcast conversation style series, as well as a ton of live play of different RPGs on the channel. Right now we've got 2 different D&D games going, both our Skygate and our Epic 6 stories, so please give those a watch and check them out as well. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.